Good afternoon. I'm Enid Slack, and I am the Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I would like to welcome you to today's virtual event on development charges and housing affordability, a false dichotomy, ? I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would also like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. And as I always do, I want to thank our team at IMFG for putting this event together today, Thomas and Piali, and the events and technical staff at the Munk School, Adam and Daria. If you are tweeting about this event, and we encourage you to do that, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. Over the past 25 or more years, Ontario's municipalities have relied on development charges to cover the growth-related capital costs associated with new development and, in some cases, redevelopment. As you know, at IMFG, we've written a number of papers on DCs. Recently, some critics of development charges have argued that they increase the price of housing and make it less affordable. Some have even argued that the province should get rid of DCs. So we asked Adam Found to explore the connection between development charges and housing affordability. His paper was released yesterday, and you can find it on the IMFG website. We're also going to put a link to it in the chat at the bottom of your screen. This afternoon, Adam will present the findings from that paper. Adam is the manager of corporate assets at the City of Kawartha Lakes. And in 2019, he was elected to the board of directors of the Municipal Finance Officers Association of Ontario, MFOA. He is also the Metropolitan Policy Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, a part-time economics faculty member at Trent University, and a public finance consultant specializing in municipal finance. He has published widely on topics that include property taxes, development charges, tax increment financing, municipal governance, and business tax competitiveness. And some of these he's even done for IMFG. So the plan for this afternoon is that Adam will speak for around 25 to 30 minutes. Then he and I will engage in a brief conversation about development charges, and then we will turn it over to you, the audience, for questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask them at any time. We will gather them and ask them to Adam at the end. So now, Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Enid, and thanks to yourself and your staff for putting this event on, and also thanks to everyone who's here for today's event. So I will now start to share my screen, and if maybe I can just get confirmation from you, Enid, that you're seeing this okay.
I can. It's not yet in presentation view, but I can see that's it.
Is it there now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, very good. Again, thanks very much for being here to everyone. So as Enid mentioned, I'm going to talk about the paper recently released under IMFG on this topic of development charges and housing affordability, and really asking the question whether there is perhaps a false dichotomy here in the sense that maybe it isn't an either or choice. So here's the outline to the presentation. I'll first do a quick introduction and talk about what I'm referring to as the popular narrative about development charges and housing affordability. I'll then talk about the fiscal challenge of growth to municipalities, the economic function of development charges, and then make a pit stop to define what housing affordability is. I think that's very important. If we're going to understand how development charges impact housing affordability, then we need to know what housing affordability means. And then finally, I'll sum up and provide some conclusions. So as Enid mentioned, municipalities in Ontario rely heavily on the use of development charges to recover growth-related capital costs. And just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what development charges are, they are one-time fees levied by municipalities on development facilitating growth, giving rise to the need to expand municipal service capacity. And according to the Association of Municipalities of Ontario and the Municipal Finance Officers Association, development charges are essential to ensuring that growth pays for itself. However, when we look at the More Homes, More Choice, Ontario's Housing Action Plan, which came out in early 2019, it sees development charges as problematic for housing affordability. And the popular narrative that that position is based on is that development charges increase housing prices by reducing housing supply and therefore diminishing housing affordability. And as you will read in the paper, I see that narrative as being invalid because it completely disregards the connection between development charges and municipal services, property taxes, and user fees. So I'll now get into the fiscal challenge of growth. And it all hinges on, in this context, it all hinges on the fact that municipal services are subject to capital indivisibilities. And there's three reasons why these indivisibilities arise. First is engineering reality. So things like, or assets like bridges, road lanes, snow plows, ice arenas, they provide all or nothing capacity. So there's no such thing as a partial road lane or a partial ice arena or partial snow plow. These things you either have or you do not, and they provide, in that sense, all or nothing capacity. There are also legal constraints. So municipalities that have water and sewage systems, landfills, etc., are subject to regulations that require advanced expansion of those assets. And then finally, we have cost factors or considerations. So for instance, we know that cost efficiency requires certain major municipal assets to be replaced highly and frequently. So I'm thinking about things like water treatment plants and trunk sewers. We know it makes no sense to replace those things on a continuous basis to adapt to the incremental changes in growth. So it makes sense, therefore, to replace them highly and frequently. And so that's what I mean by capital indivisibility, meaning that we can't incrementally expand municipal services. And so that's a bit of a challenge because by contrast, growth does occur gradually or rather incrementally over time. So what that means is growth is highly divisible relative to growth-related capital assets. And so what that means is in order to maintain service levels cost efficiently, extension of services to growth necessarily entails creation of excess capacity. Municipal capital costs relating to growth, which could be years or even decades into the future, are thus incurred upfront. A necessary condition of full cost recovery in terms of efficient property taxes and user fees is that those property taxes and user fees are based on full utilization of capacity. However, growth, as I said, occurs gradually, and therefore it will only generate generate revenue gradually, and then only upon its materialization. Therefore, property taxes and user fees fail to fully recover growth-related capital costs. And this is something that can be proven mathematically. It's not very hard to prove, but you can just imagine if you've got a very large asset that has lots of excess capacity, and in order to pay for it, you're going to have to wait for all this growth to happen, then it's certainly going to be the case that the average contribution to that growth in terms of, let's say, households, will not be around for some time in order to pay its fair share of the cost of that asset. So if municipalities have recourse only to property taxes and user fees to recover these growth-related costs, then that means they'll have to levy inefficiently high property taxes and user fees. So what that means is that ultimately some of these growth-related capital costs are then shifted to established ratepayers in the form of excessive property taxes and user fees. As a result, established ratepayers then, as you would expect, call for lower service levels and greater restrictions on development, understanding that growth is the source of this problem. And so because the literature doesn't really give a name to this problem, or let alone identify the problem, I had to give it a name. And so I've referred to it as the externality of excess capacity, because it is a fiscal externality that works through the municipal system, and it is in relation to excess capacity. So I thought that would be a fitting name for the problem. So let me finalize this little section here on the fiscal challenge of growth with answering this question. Why do the excessive property taxes and user fees driving that externality of excess capacity arise? Well, I could take you through 3 steps that get you to the answer. As we saw, efficiency, because of capital indivisibilities, requires the upfront creation of excess capacity. That's undeniable. Indivisible capital costs, by definition, are driven by capacity, not population. So again, that's just a given. And then finally, population is always below capacity, meaning that when we take costs and we divide them by population to develop our property tax rates and our user fees, we'll always end up with property tax rates and user fees that are higher than if we take costs and divide them by capacity as measured by, let's say, households. And so that's why we end up with the excessive property taxes and user fees, because of this externality of excess capacity. So that leads us to the economic function of development charges. Because now we're in a situation where if municipalities keep their property taxes and user fees at efficient levels, they're not going to fully recover these growth-related capital costs from the growth that's generating them. And so in order to pick up the residual costs, then municipalities need a different instrument, something other than property taxes and user fees. And that instrument is development charges. And so when they're properly formulated, they recover from growth the portion of growth-related capital costs that is necessarily unrecoverable by efficient property taxes and user fees. So that means development charges work in conjunction with, but they are not replaceable by property taxes and user fees. So in other words, there isn't a substitutability between development charges and property taxes and user fees, unless of course you're willing to have excessive property taxes and user fees. And I should just note, and I do explain a little bit about this in the paper, that Ontario's Development Charges Act is not consistent with this conception of development charges. Okay, so with all that said, we understand what the fiscal challenge of growth is to municipalities. We understand then how that leads to the externality of excess capacity and how that entails the need for development charges. So now it's it makes sense for us to look at this question of housing affordability to ensure we have a common understanding of what this means. And that's because opposition to development charges very often is fueled by the belief that such charges reduce housing supply and therefore increase housing prices. And it's in this sense that development charges are therefore thought to diminish housing affordability. And as I mentioned earlier on, the problem with that approach is that it relies on an invalid premise that housing affordability is measurable only by the price of housing. What we need to, if we're going to think about all this in a municipal context, we need to recognize a couple of things. So one is that housing is affixed to land. So when housing is constructed, it's not going anywhere, except in very rare cases. The other thing we need to recognize is that municipal services are tied to location. And so then what that means is that if we're talking about housing that is in a municipality, then necessarily we're talking about a situation where housing must be consumed jointly with municipal services. There's no way around it, right? You can't have housing in a municipality and no services, and you can't have the services without the housing. And so what that means is every household in a municipality necessarily is consuming jointly its housing with municipal services. And that's a very important point to keep in mind. So what that means is, as I mentioned in the paper, we need to think about affordability in terms of housing municipality packages, not just in terms of the price of housing. So when we want to measure housing affordability, then we need to understand that really what it refers to is the economic well-being of households. There's really no other way to define housing affordability, and that's a bit of a challenge in the literature, as I mentioned in the paper. So we need to understand that housing affordability refers to economic well-being of households as derived from joint consumption of housing and municipal services. So again, we're looking at things here in a municipal context. So we can't just disregard municipal services. We have to look at housing and municipal services together. Now, as economists, and I know there's at least one other economist on the line here, we measure economic well-being as consumer surplus. And technically what that means is we look at the difference between what households are willing to pay versus what they actually pay for consumption. That's what's meant by consumer surplus as our measure of economic well-being or welfare. A word that we'll use is welfare to refer to that notion. So what all this means is housing affordability depends not only on housing prices, but also municipal services and levies. So I just want to emphasize that point because it's critical to the analysis. Okay, so now that we have that established, and again, we're thinking within a municipal context here, we can then understand that housing affordability is affected by development charges through three channels. The first is housing production cost, and everybody agrees on that. That's certainly very relevant. The next is property taxes and user fees. And then the third one is municipal services. And then what we can do is take those latter two, lump them together and refer to them as the municipal environment. So it'll just be easier that way to work with the two of them lumped together. Now, the problem is that critics often focus on only the first channel, which is housing production costs. And by doing that, then they invalidly conclude that development charges must reduce housing affordability. And as you can see just from this list here, that indeed that is invalid because it completely disregards the two other channels that I have listed there. So in order to visualize what I'm talking about here, let's just take a quick look at a stock flow model of a municipality's housing market. So stock flow here is a very appropriate use for this context, because we're talking about housing. And we know that housing, as the first bullet point states there, housing is fixed because it is durable and immobile once it's produced. So any housing that exists now, we can consider to be fixed. It's not going anywhere. Now that means, because the existing stock of housing is so large compared to growth, that price then is determined by that existing stock of housing when it interacts with demand. So that's what determines the price. And then based on that price, developers will determine the flow of new housing, or in other words, housing production, based on their situation in the development industry. So that's how this kind of model is structured. And I'll just quickly show a graph. And I know it's a bit busy, so I would just ask that you focus on the solidly drawn figures only, or I should say curves only. So if we look at the left-hand panel, that's the existing community. And we have price on the vertical axis. We have amount of housing on the horizontal axis. And you'll see there's a vertical line at H bar, at the value H bar, and that represents the existing housing stock. And the reason why that supply curve is vertical is, again, because the existing stock is fixed. It's not going anywhere. And then the downward sloping solid line that you'll see there is the initial demand curve. And where the two intersect, that gives us the price, P star. Then you'll follow the dashed line at the P star level across to the right-hand panel. And what that panel shows us is the anticipated growth based on what developers will build based on the price. And that's determined where the price intersects the supply curve. So that's the lower curve there, or the solidly drawn curve there, SP. And you'll see that based on that price, developers will build H star, little h star, amount of units over whatever the growth horizon might be here. It could be 50 years or something like that. So that's how the stock flow model works. And now what I'll do is I'll talk about the other curves in the graph now with the next couple of slides. Because what we're going to do is now take that model and introduce development charges as conceived in the previous slides. And as I do in the paper, I'm going to break that the adjustment to that introduction down into two stages. So stage one of adjustment will be focused on the demand side. That means really focused on the left-hand panel of that diagram. So the first thing to note is that development charges are going to raise service levels and reduce property taxes and user fees. So in other words, the municipal environment is going to be improved. And households value that. And because they value that, their demand for housing shifts up. And because of the way the market is structured, you have a vertical supply curve there. That means the housing price goes up by exactly that amount. And that amount is the value of the improvement to the municipal environment. So that occurs through competition for housing. And what that means for households in terms of welfare is that when we look at established households, well, clearly they're better off by that value of the improvement to municipal environment because they've already have homes in the municipality. So they're unambiguously better off. Now, when we look at income in households, it turns out that they're so far, granted we haven't gone through all the adjustments yet, so far they're indifferent because to them, they have this improvement in the municipal environment that they value, but then they also have this price increase for housing, and the two exactly cancel each other out. So for the income in households, so far, they're indifferent about the introduction of development charges to this municipality. So now we'll go to stage two, which has to do with the supply side of the market. So the right-hand panel that we looked at earlier. So what happens there is that development charges obviously will push up the marginal cost of housing production. So for example, if development charges are $60,000 per house, well, the marginal cost of producing housing for developers has just gone up by $60,000 per house. So there's no dispute in that. And what that means is the housing supply curve will shift upwards. So now we get to the interesting part of the analysis. What happens to housing production? And the answer will depend on how the rate of development charges compares to the price increase, because if you put yourself in the excuse me, the shoes of the developers, you've got offsetting things happening here. On the one hand, you're having to pay these development charges, which is a new cost to business. But on the other hand, you have this price increase that of course you're going to enjoy. And so you have to weigh these things to determine whether you're going to produce less, more, or the same amount of housing compared to before. So that leads us to rather, three possible cases. And I put them in terms of the extent to which development charges are shifted into the housing price. So the first possible case is undershifting. So that's where the rate of development charges exceeds the price increase. And that will clearly reduce housing production. The second case is exact shifting. And that's where the rate of development charges exactly equals the price increase. And of course, if that happens, then developers don't change their behavior. They will produce the same amount of housing as they would have before. And then the final case is overshifting. And that's where the rate of development charges is exceeded by the price increase, and thus will lead developers to increase housing production. All right, so let's go back for a second here. Recall that income and households are indifferent about development charges before developers respond. So what that means is when we look at the change in income and households welfare, it depends only on the change in housing production. It doesn't depend on the change in the housing price, as we saw earlier. And so in turn, what that means is their welfare is affected only by the change in the timing of their joining the municipality in this model. That's the only way in which development charges will impact their welfare, those being the income and households. But as I mentioned in the paper, it really doesn't matter from an efficiency perspective. It really doesn't matter which case arises, because the welfare of all households involved taken collectively is improved by development charges. And why is that? Because development charges, when they're properly formulated, are designed to resolve an externality. So they get rid of an externality, or at least prevent one from occurring. And we know that it is a maximum in economics that whenever an externality is resolved, all involved parties, or rather, involved parties are made collectively better off, even if some parties happen to be made worse off. But if we look at the empirical literature on this, and granted, it's not the greatest in terms of robustness, but when we look at that empirical literature, the evidence favors the overshifting case. And so what that would suggest is that development charges are in fact improving welfare even for income in households. So not just for the existing households, but also for the income in households. So when you take all of what we just discussed and you distill it down to the critical implications that come out of it, these are the two that I think are probably the most important. So the first one is that development charges raise housing prices, yes, but they do so precisely because they make housing more affordable. And I can understand that that seems counterintuitive, but again, we have to think about housing affordability more broadly than maybe it has been thought of before. We have to, again, in a municipal context, we have to understand that housing affordability is not just about what does it cost to produce housing, but also what does it cost the residents in terms of their municipal services. And so that's an interesting implication. So that first implication speaks to the direction of the impact on housing affordability of development charges. The second implication speaks to the magnitude of that impact. And what it says is that development charges improve housing affordability the more they are shifted into housing prices. So again, that might seem counterintuitive, right? How is that the case? Well, again, we have to understand that the housing price increase has to do with what's happening with the municipal services. And the greater extent to which the municipal services are improved because of development charges, then the greater the housing price increase will be. So those to me are the two most critical implications coming out of this analysis. So now let's relate that back to that popular narrative I started the presentation with. And understand that those implications run entirely counter to that popular narrative. So recall that the popular narrative is based on the following two premises: that first of all, development charges necessarily reduce housing production. And I've just showed that that is not the case. It may, but it's not necessarily the case. And the evidence so far indicates that it's not the case. And then number two, that development charges harm households to the extent that they are incorporated into housing prices. So what I just showed you is that the more that they are incorporated into housing prices, the better off households are actually. So the implications I noted on the previous slide really do run counter to these premises that underlie the popular narrative. So what this means to me is that the premises underlying that popular narrative really are invalid. So let me provide a summary of what we've just discussed and some conclusions. So first off, municipal services are subject to capital indivisibilities. So remember what that meant was that when municipalities go to expand their services to integrate growth into their communities, they necessarily have to create excess capacity. It's the only way that it can be done cost efficiently. Now, what we also learned is that if municipalities have recourse only to property taxes and user fees, then because growth occurs gradually, then they will have to levy excessive fees. And that's what leads us to the economic function of development charges. Their role is to make up the difference between what the property taxes and user fees can collect and what absolutely needs to be collected in terms of cost recovery. The other critical thing we need to keep in mind is that housing in a municipality is necessarily consumed jointly with the municipal services. And therefore that when we think about housing affordability in the municipal context, we can't just think about the price of housing. We have to think about how municipal services are impacted and how municipal services, including levies, relate to household welfare. And then finally, as we saw, the introduction of properly formulated development charges improves the welfare of households collectively and therefore housing affordability, because again, they resolve an externality, and that's a maxim of economics. So with that, Enid, I believe I can conclude my presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam. And you can stop sharing the screen, I guess. That was a great presentation, very comprehensive, very clear. I always worry when you put up these graphs that we're going to lose the audience, but I quickly checked the numbers and we didn't. so you must have done a clear explanation. We do have some questions already that have come in, and I encourage the audience to put their questions in the Q&A.
I hope the questions are, when is he going to stop?
No, I haven't seen any of those.
Okay.
But let me ask a couple to start, and then we'll go to the audience questions. As I said at the beginning, there have been calls by a lot of critics that we should get rid of development charges in Ontario, that they're terrible and awful and we should just get rid of them. Suppose the province did. Suppose the province decided to disallow municipalities from levying development charges going forward. How do you think municipalities would respond? And will ending the practice of charging developments charges improve housing affordability or worsen it?
Oh, that's a great question. It really goes to the heart of what we're talking about here today. Well, let me first say what will happen is clearly municipalities are going to respond. They're not going to simply just, I mean, I would say you can't just assume they're going to conduct business as usual. As the model and analysis show, there will be immense pressure on them to increase property taxes and user fees, and by quite a bit. We could be talking about increases like 20%, 30% easily. That could be the case, just to enable the property tax and user fee systems to pay for all this growth-related infrastructure. But I think the thing to really keep in mind is, and I think it goes to the latter part of your question, well, what impact would that have on housing affordability in the long run? So clearly what I've showed is a case for development charges making housing affordability better. So presumably if you get rid of development charges, it's going to worsen housing affordability. And not just for the reasons that I showed, but also because we have to think about what municipalities can do ultimately. And it's not just about property taxes and user fees, but it's about the powers that municipalities have, which is in this context to either slow down or even halt development. And municipalities can do that by withholding development approvals. They can do that by withholding essential services like water, sewage, and roads. And so I think you can quickly imagine a case where a municipality that is very much impacted by the removal of development charges simply says to itself, it's not worth it for us to grow. And so we're not going to allow any growth. And of course, I think as you might be alluding to in your question, that will exacerbate whatever housing affordability problems that we already have. So that would be my response to that kind of proposal.
Okay. There's a question here about rewriting the Ontario Development Charges Act. And I had a question, but one of the audience members did too, and I'm going to put them together. You keep referring to properly designed development charges, particularly in the paper, and how that will improve housing affordability. Are they properly designed in Ontario now? And if not, what changes do you think need to be made? And the audience question is, again, if you could rewrite the Ontario DC Act to internalize the externality you've noted, would DCs be higher or lower?
Oh yeah, those are great questions, and you're right to put them together. They're very much twin questions. So let me start with the first one. The short answer is no. DCs in Ontario right now are not properly formulated. And that's really because of two reasons. So when we look at the Development Charges Act, there's really two sets of, excuse me, there are really two sets of deficiencies with that legislation. So the first set has to do with capital cost recovery. There's a whole bunch of provisions in the legislation that explicitly limit the extent to which growth-related capital costs can actually be recovered through development charges. So there's exemptions for certain types of development, certain services are ineligible, certain types of capital costs are ineligible. So there's all kinds of things like that that will make capital cost recovery deficient. The other set of deficiencies in the legislation really has to do with the other side of the equation, which is the revenue that growth generates when it occurs. So I don't think anybody's pretending that, growth doesn't pay property taxes and user fees. Of course it does. I think just what I'm arguing is that when you look at the lifespan of a growth-related capital asset, growth will not be around for long enough to fully repay the cost of that asset. So I think what the act is also missing is a recognition that growth is generating all these revenues that will in part help recover those growth-related capital costs. It's just that they don't fully recover them. And so these two sets of deficiencies are offsetting. So the first set lowers DC rates, the second set raises DC rates. And to be very honest, I don't think anybody knows how that nets out. So I can't tell you, and that goes to the second question. I can't tell you whether DC rates right now are too high or too low because of those two offsetting deficiencies in the legislation. Now, as to the idea of rewriting the DC Act, I've been a big fan of that for a long time now. It needs to be completely overhauled, and in fact, what I would suggest is repealing it altogether, and then bringing new development charges legislation into the Municipal Act, and to bring all municipal finance legislation under one roof, so to speak.
And I think you said that in the previous development charges paper you wrote for us.
Well, I'm nothing if I'm not consistent, right?
That's right. A follow-up question is about soft services. So are there certain growth-related capital costs for soft services, for example, construction of community centers, libraries, that are not covered by development charges? And how does that impact housing affordability, their exclusion from development charges? How does that impact affordability?
Yeah, well, if I can take an all else equal approach to it, I can certainly answer that question, because there's lots of different moving parts here. So let's say we had a very nice system whereby development charges are being properly designed and levied, and there were no restrictions. And then all of a sudden we come up with a restriction that says you can't have development charges for these soft services. Then again, I go back to the paper in the slides. You're going to have a negative effect ultimately on housing affordability, because not only because municipal services or the municipal environment is going to deteriorate, especially in terms of property taxes and user fees, they're going to go up and they're going to make housing less affordable, but also because, again, municipalities aren't stupid. They're likely to respond in some way in terms of their powers over development. And so if that kind of restriction on development charges for soft services means that ultimately municipalities are going to approve less development than they would otherwise, then that's a negative impact on housing affordability.
Okay, we have lots more questions, so let me keep going through them. Here's a question. Do you feel that part of the housing supply issue is that the developers control the release of new units in order to drive up competition, and therefore prices become inflated, and that affects affordability? There are significant improved developments in the pipeline.
Well, admittedly, I don't really know the answer to that question, but what I can say is that, my sense is that the development industry could use a lot more competition than it currently has. And I do speak to that a little bit in the paper, but not very much, because it is a bit out of scope. But my sense is that if the development industry were more competitive and there were less barriers to entry to that industry, then I think you would see a lot less of what the questioner is asking about, if indeed that is happening. Because what we know about a competitive market is it's very hard to control the price, right? That's sort of one of the main virtues of a competitive market, is that you're a small player among many other players. And so if you try to withhold your supply in order to raise the price, you're really not going to have much effect. So I guess my answer to the question is, if that sort of activity is happening, which isn't good for society, then the best way to combat it is to try to make the development industry more competitive.
So here's a related question. What if the developer can't increase the supply of housing if prices increase due to other constraints, for example, land constraints?
That's certainly a challenge, and certainly there are various constraints that developers are going to face. There's, for instance, sometimes there's very long, protracted development approval processes that can certainly hold up supply. We know there are taxes such as sales taxes, land transfer taxes that are also going to play a role here. So I would suggest it's not just land constraints, but also in terms of zoning and things like that, but also lots of other fiscal constraints that play a role here too.
Okay, we'll keep going. So here's a question about some of the economic efficiency arguments you were talking about. To what extent does the ability to charge new users a higher user fee or levy regionally variable property taxes, for example, special purpose bodies setting higher rates for services in greenfield areas, as is common in the US, how would that allow governments to match the economic efficiency of development charges? In other words, can you reach that efficiency by differential property taxes and user fees based on location or type of development?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have to admit, I've never thought of that question specifically. What I can say is that a more nuanced use of property taxes and user fees along the lines the questioner is suggesting solves a problem that's different than the one that development charges is solving. So I think what the questioner has in mind is that, well, we've got these different areas of our city that are associated with differential costs of municipal services. And so maybe we should try to use property taxes and user fees in a more differential way to match those differential costs. And there's an economic argument to that. And I think, Enid, you've wrote about that issue in a number of places. And I think there is some merit to that. It's not always easy to do. And I know municipalities generally are reluctant to get into that sort of thing. But to me, that's a different problem. You see, DCs is solving an externality that has to do with cost recovery. Whereas the problem that the questioner, I think, has in mind has to do with solving the issue of differential costs between different areas of the city, and property taxes and user fees are the appropriate tool for that. Now, I will add to that, DCs can be differentially charged as well. And in fact,
and that leads to my next question. So let me ask the question.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on innovative alternative DCs to encourage the type of housing in the right places for specific objectives versus higher rates for what municipalities don't need or want? Does this require changes to the Ontario DC Act as you were discussing? I'm not as concerned about changes to the legislation as your opinion on using DCs in that way. I think you were starting to go that way to say that DCs could be differentiated as the questioner, previous question.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, no, I'm glad that you stopped me where I did, because it leads to a more interesting question. So yes, DCs can and are, and sometimes differentially charged according to differential costs in different areas of a municipality, and that's perfectly fine. And in fact, probably most economists would say, look, if you're going to use DCs, maybe you should think about differentially charging them where it does make sense to do so. Now, with that said, I'm not a fan of using development charges for anything but their intended purpose. And so, again, as I've conceived of development charges, they have a very specific purpose, which is to recover the portion of growth-related capital costs from growth that cannot otherwise be recovered by efficient property taxes and user fees. As soon as you deviate from that standard, then DCs become something else entirely. And so what I would suggest is keeping or leaving DCs to their proper function. And then if there are community planning challenges that need to be addressed, and I do talk about this in the paper in a box, then those challenges are better addressed through different tools. And those tools could be fiscal in nature. They could be, excuse me, they could be growth controls, things like that, zoning, all the various tools are out there. And so I would just prefer to separate the two issues, use DCs for what they're intended to do, and then use all the other planning tools for what they're intended to do. And I think everything is kind of cleaner that way. That's what I would suggest.
The growth related capital costs are different in different locations or for different types of housing. Would you differentiate the charge?
Well, certainly that is permitted under the Development Charges Act,
Right.
to use differential DCs in that way. I think the challenge is trying to comply with the Act's various requirements in the formulation of DCs, and then layering on top of that the complexity of differential charging. And I think that's, to me, one of the big deterrents to municipalities when it comes to differentially charging DCs. I think if there were less, if the legislation were less onerous, then I think municipalities would be more open to that idea.
Okay. We have a question here about excess capacity. You say that capacity is always in excess of population, but this is only really true in terms of water, wastewater, and electricity. Otherwise, in many cases, we have excess population in regards to capacity because municipalities delay the construction of things like community centers, roads, libraries, buses, etc. The way we deal with excess demand is to supply the way we deal with excess demand over supply is through congestion, and we see that in many instances. So that's a comment, but maybe you could comment on the comment.
I can certainly comment on the comment. It's true that sometimes we have, I guess, what I would refer to as excessive congestion. So we have to think about municipal services in a broad way. So when I think about, let's say, roads, it's not just about, you know, the lane kilometers and the surface type and that sort of thing, but it's also about how congested is the road, right? How much capacity is there in the road versus the usage? And that congestion factor becomes part of the municipal service package. And so it's true that in some cases a municipality might let an asset become overly congested, but then that just becomes, that congestion cost is a growth related cost, right? And so you can actually just modify the model I've come up with to just broaden it a little bit to encompass those congestion costs as well. So in other words, just letting your assets become overcrowded doesn't get you out of the problem, because all you've done is you've just shifted the problem to being one of congestion instead of one of excess capacity. And they have the same, they're like cousins, I guess you could say, in a way. So it doesn't really get you out of the fundamental problem at all. And then I would just, Enid, if I can, I would just simply state that it's not true that excess capacity is only relevant to water and sewer. It is most certainly relevant to probably almost all municipal services. And let me actually just pick out a very simple example. So if a municipality purchases a snowplow, well, you can't have a fraction of a snowplow, right? You can only have 1 or 0 when you're making that decision. And so even when you get down to the nitty gritty level of just a snowplow, and that's a very small capital expense compared to, let's say, facilities and sewer mains and things like that, even when you get down to something like that, you still have an indivisibility problem. So I would suggest, I think, to the questioner that this indivisibility problem is quite widespread. It's not just something that is confronted by water and sewage services.
Okay, I'm struggling here because there are so many questions we're not going to be able to get to. Let me see. I'll ask one last question, and for the audience, these questions all get saved and will be sent to Adam after the event, and so that your questions are not lost and he may respond to them at a later time. Would you care to complicate the analysis further? I don't know if you want to answer that question yet. Two issues arise: the issue of incidence as between developers and buyers, depending on the relevant elasticity reaction. Secondly, developers complain about the costs imposed by planning. I think your paper goes to the heart of that issue in terms of planning adding value rather than cost. Do you want to comment? That's your last comment.
Yeah, that's more of a comment than a question, right? Yeah, well, let me talk about the second issue first, and that is that yes, we do need to think about the value of municipal services. It's absolutely critical to this analysis. You cannot think about development charges and housing affordability in a vacuum. And unfortunately, I think in the literature, that's largely what we see, is the consideration of those two things in a vacuum and just sort of setting municipal services off to the side like they don't matter. They do matter, and not just the services, but of course the property taxes and user fees and so on. So I do agree with that second part of the comment. I think the first part, it has to do with, you have to remind me again. I've lost my train of thought. What was the first part of the comment?
It was on the incidents.
Yeah, the incidents. Okay. So again, I go back to that stock flow model that I have. So when you have a large base of existing housing, and then you've got incremental growth that builds on that over time, what part of that do you think is going to set the price? The growth or the existing base? Well, obviously the existing base is going to, because the growth is maybe 1%, 2% a year of your existing stock. And so that existing stock is going to set the price. And as the diagram showed, when you have that situation of a stock flow dynamic, then developers are just going to be taking that price as given. That because they can't do anything about it, right? You can't do anything about the existing stock. It is what it is. And in fact, I can tell you that in my community here in Kawartha Lakes, it's only with the recent and rapid rise of housing prices here that a lot of developers have finally come out of the woodwork and said, hey, we want building permits. We're ready to go. And so, to me, what that signifies is that in a lot of cases, developers are just simply sitting around waiting for the right price to come along. And that's fine. That's how markets work. So I don't think, in other words, I don't think the incidence is important, because as the analysis shows, the development charges make housing affordability better regardless of what the incidence is. And I think that would be really my main response to that comment.
Okay, well, that does bring us to the end. And I want to thank you so much, Adam, both for writing the paper and for presenting it here today. And excuse me, I'd also like to thank the audience for what in person would have been a very lively discussion, but even online, there are lots of questions, and I'm afraid I couldn't get to all of them, but I tried to get the gist of them out. Today's event has been recorded and will be available on our website in the weeks to come. There was a question about the PowerPoint slides, and they will be on our website tomorrow. So you can get copies of the slides, and of course the paper is on our website as well. So please share the event with your colleagues who couldn't come today. And thank you again, and have a great evening.